Hollywood film salutes the American working man.
For labor we sing, for labor is king of all that we strive on earth. The might of its throne is the light of the dawn that gives tomorrow birth. On comes the mighty sword and pen, it rules the destinies of men.
And now behold labor's triumph, the smooth, glistening body of machine, the song of victory. Here is no straining of human flesh. The spirit of steel, the joyous chant of motion, the exultant twirling of spinning wheels, the thunder of untiring pistons. It is the song of the dynamo. It is the song that labor sings in tribute to science and invention.
Higher profits are being generated as fast as new machinery and production methods are introduced. But the greatest single advance is mass production itself through the moving assembly line. Starting in the car industry, the assembly line is transforming the daily lives of millions of people. Never before has a change in the way people work brought so much wealth, but also so much alienation and conflict. By the start of the 20th century, the great shift from the country to the cities was well underway. In Europe, the best-paid workers were those who'd moved to the new factories that produced the heavy machinery of the industrial age. The most respected were those whose combined physical strength and skill had taken years to acquire: boilermakers, riveters, foundrymen. As the age of steam gave way to electricity and oil, the nature of the work to be done changed too. Small engines needed a new type of precision. The skilled men who built them belonged to craft unions and worked at their own pace. Despite the manufacturer's hopes, this was not to be the century of the motorbike. The new machine that would do most to change both the world and the way people worked was the car. Thousands of craftsmen worked for the many companies competing for a share of the new market before the First World War. In Britain, the Vulcan Motor Company were proud to film the way their workers assembled cars so slowly, by hand. Charles Hill started as a Vulcan apprentice when he was 14.
Everybody seemed to be busy doing something, and it was only as you went through and going through it yourself, you realised that every man was in one sense, a specialist in his own particular job. There were men, skilled men there when I went there. They were there all their life to the dying day. All skilled craftsmen in their own sphere. In the body shop, there was a lot of wood framing of the motor car body. And then there was panel beaters who, to take the shape of panels on a car, it was done with hammers to bend them round and make bulbous corners. It was all done with a planishing hammer.
Craftsmen controlled the way they did their work. The whole process took several weeks from start to finish. and they took pride in the results.
You were walking down Lord Street, the main town, and see these cars that you'd actually worked on, and people riding in cars. And cars were more of a novelty than they are today. And it gave you an ego.
It was a time when a wide gulf separated those who built cars from those who bought them. But the days when cars were just luxuries for the rich were drawing to a close. America now set the pace in engineering and production. European managers and workers knew that what was happening in American factories pointed the way of the future. And in 1908, one man had a vision that would change manufacturing and create a new market. Henry Ford set out to make the simplest car ever, a car for rural America, a 20th century equivalent of the covered wagon.
Rambled right along, and the little old Ford rambled right along. The gas ran out in the big machine, but the darned little Ford don't need gasoline. The big limousine had to back down the hill, but the blamed little Ford is going up still. When it runs out of dope, just fill it up with soap, and the little Ford will ramble right along.
To produce the Model T as cheaply as he wanted, Ford knew he had to change the way cars were built. That meant changing the way his workers worked. As he reorganized his factory to turn out Model Ts, he was influenced by the efficiency expert, Frederick Taylor. Taylor had complained that hardly a workman can be found who doesn't devote his time to studying just how slowly he can work. And then he devoted his life to speeding them up. When Taylor was brought in, he first timed the workers with stopwatches and noted every movement they made. In a famous experiment at an ironworks, he reorganized a worker called Schmidt. Previously, Schmidt had hand-carried 12 tons of pig iron a day up from a wagon. After Taylor rearranged things, the forbearing Schmidt found himself carrying 47 tons, and production had been raised 300%. Called into an office, Taylor helped the world's fastest typist type even faster. The new world record of 150 words a minute was achieved by Margaret Owen, but Taylor claimed much of the credit. At Ford's factory, Taylorism meant dividing car production into simple, repetitive steps. There was to be no need for skilled craftsmen with years of apprenticeship. Men could learn to do any job quickly. A trained wheelwright no longer made each wheel in its entirety. Wheel making was broken down into almost 100 stages, done by different men at different machines. It was much faster, but workers could still complete only 200 cars a day. So in 1913, Ford introduced his most revolutionary change yet.
In those days, each car was built from the frame up on stationary wooden horses.
Later, the company filmed a reconstruction of how Ford tried out his new idea.
Henry Ford watched it for a while, then he had an inspiration. Instead of moving the men past the cars, why not move the cars past the men? So on one hot August morning, they tried it that way. A husky young fellow put a rope over his shoulder, and Henry Ford called, "Let's go." And at that very moment, as the workmen began to fasten the parts onto the slowly moving car, the assembly line was born.
To deliver the parts to the exact point on the line, engineers put in a network of clanking conveyors.
They were running for the length of the building, like, you know. like carrying the parts. Instead of you carrying it by hands, why the conveyors would carry it on the line. And it was really marvelous the way things moved. That not one brain was doing that. There was a lot of brains working together.
The workers became an integrated part of the great machine, and the management set the speed it ran at without discussion or negotiation, for unions were forbidden. The men faced new pressure as the final assembly line beat out the rhythm for the whole factory. There was no way they could stop or slow it down. Few stood the pace and din for long. Men tried it for a few weeks and then quit. But Ford had an answer. The company was making record profits. The time taken to build each car had dropped to 1.5 hours. So he could afford to raise pay. When he announced he was doubling wages to the unheard of level of $5 a day, the factory was besieged by applicants. Red Cole was 18 when he started at Ford.
The thing about Mr. Ford that stuck in my mind mostly was that he started to pay $5 a day. And Mr. Ford to me was like a god. He was like a god, and because he had the control of so many thousands of people, and he had them in such order, the lines, the production lines, the coming and going, the shifts, 3 shifts, 8 hours each shift, days, afternoons, and midnights. And everything to me was so clockwork that I was so proud to be a part of it. I loved it.
By 1920, Detroit was a boom town. Its population had grown 4-fold since 1900. Other car makers adopted the Ford method. His recipe, mass production, low costs, high wages, was creating not only cheap cars, but well-paid workers. Ford built a new factory, which was the largest in the world. At the River Rouge plant, coal, iron, sand, and rubber were delivered at one end, and 2,500 Model Ts a day streamed out of the other. Up to 80,000 men worked there.
I was lost. You know, I was really lost with the size of it and the noise of it, and where you hung your clothes, where you eat your lunch, where did you put your lunch. You just didn't know, and you was afraid to go any place. Seeing these fellas doing one thing, somebody else is doing another thing, and all this different machinery. It was amazing to see all this. It was amazing.
Above all, it was the constant supply of new men arriving in Detroit that made it possible. The company set the terms. Provided they worked fast and obeyed orders, they got the wages. Over 70% were recent immigrants. So the company had its own language schools.
I fill the kettle with water.
And Ford played the different groups off against each other. Italians and Poles, Germans and Greeks, white American and black, to keep up the speed.
They said, nigger, if you don't want to get that production, we got some hunkies out here on Miller Road will do it. They'd go back to a southern white guy and they'd say, look, if you crackers can't get this production, we got some Dagos and some niggers out there on Miller Road can do the same. We'll take your job.
Ford's private security force, the Plant Protection Service, kept discipline. Anyone who recruited for the unions was fired. Company spies kept a lookout for those considered to be troublemakers. Instead, Ford stressed all the material benefits high pay could bring. Workers were encouraged to put part of their wages aside each week towards their own car in a company-run savings scheme.
You know, you can afford this, you can afford that, you can afford a new car.
In 1924, the 10 millionth Model T rolled off the line. Ford's advertising department made the most of it. As the car was driven from coast to coast, it crossed a country that was being transformed by the moving assembly line. For America, the 1920s were the start of a consumer society in which a whole range of new products came within reach of ordinary people. Factories now turned out furniture and ready-made clothes. Electric appliances were cheaper than ever before. The cycle had started. Mass production was feeding mass consumption, leading to yet more production. The radio had almost as great an impact as the car, bringing advertising and popular music into the home. When a Philadelphia company wanted to make the cheapest wireless yet, they took on a new workforce. They needed no experience or electrical knowledge, so long as they were nimble enough to put the small parts together. Margaret Colombo's only qualification was that she'd played the mandolin.
He looked at my hands, and I had the long fingers. And believe it or not, when I went there was 3 others besides me, and I was the 4th one went in there, and they all had long fingers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He knew that's what he wanted. He wanted the fingers. Yeah.
The work was so easy to pick up that Philco workers sometimes swapped jobs just to vary the routine.
When you're sitting in one spot and you're doing the same job for a couple of hundred sets, that's a lot of, and it got boring, and some of them just wasn't cut out for it. Yet I had other girlfriends that liked it.
The compensation for the relentless tedium was the high wages. By the mid-20s, 1 in 5 Americans owned a car, a figure that Britain wouldn't equal for another 40 years.
It was a Ford Model T with a rumble seat. That's the kind of a car. Black. And you take your friends out and they get blown all apart in the rumble seat. But, oh, I had a lot of fun with that car.
At the end of the decade, there were already 29 million cars on America's roads, and half of them were Model Ts. The affordable car changed where people lived, where they worked, how they shopped, how they spent their leisure. Not all Americans could achieve this standard of living, but the ones who did became the envy of the rest of the world. Other nations hoped the assembly line could do the same trick for their own prosperity. Italy had only 250,000 cars in the 1920s. But Fiat in Turin was one of the first European car firms to copy Ford. Its large new plant was a wonder of its time, to be admired and recorded. From the factory's floor, spiral concrete ramps led up to a test track on the roof.
Il senatore Agnelli e anche I capi fabbrica, I capi
Senator Agnelli, the plant manager and the production manager at the time, were often in America and were on good terms with Ford.
Per cui quello che succedeva là si
They would try out what they were doing there, and if it was possible, bring it here.
In questo posto.
In the beginning, the assembly line was run by hand, worked by the men.
Poi man mano che si è progredito,
Later, they motorized the line with a chain.
una linea con una catena.
As in America, the faster the chain pulled the cars and engines along, the faster each man had to work. Giovanni Gobbi was a young supervisor.
Poi un bel momento i miei superiori d'allora mi hanno messo in mano.
One day, my boss put a stopwatch in my hand and said, "Go and time how long it takes to do that job."
Dal fatto di venire a contatto con
One
una
of the
persona
first people I had to time was a man who could have been my grandfather.
mio padre, ma addirittura mio nonno, coi baffi
He
alla
had the sort of
cinese.
long Chinese-style moustache people had then. The poor man was working away, and I was a young kid having to time him. It was awful.
Questo non mi
I couldn't do it and
andava.
asked
Mi
for a
sono un
different
po'
job.
ribellato e ho chiesto che mi cambiassero posto.
Steady when they're turning round the corner, in comfort when the roads are badly laid. Speeding along, sweet as a song, comes the Ford that
Britain had more car workers than any other European country. Ford had had a British factory since 1912.
in the shining beauty all arrayed. Speeding along, sweet as a song, comes the Ford that has just been made.
But there were still only 1 million cars on British roads by 1929. Morris, the biggest domestic producer, made a film to promote their plant at Cowley, near Oxford.
Hello.
Hello, dear. Had a good day?
Yes, rather. I say, I wish you'd been with me. I've been to Cowley. You know, where they make Morris cars. That's awfully interesting.
That doesn't sound frightfully amusing to me. Aren't all these motorworks very dirty and noisy and rather dull?
Oh, not at all. Frankly, I've had a very good time.
At the pressed steel factory next to Morris, where they made car bodies, ex-coal miner Hayden Evans had a different view of it all.
My first impression was, what a terrible racket, what a terrible din. Gracious me, how can you possibly stick this? It is bang, 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 with sounds from everywhere, you know, beating metal. It's hard to describe, very hard to describe. You've got to be in it to appreciate, and yet I ended up on the machines that was making the loudest noise in the motorworks.
Giant presses had replaced the hammers of the early British craftsmen at Vulcan.
One day I was turning these doors over, trip-hammering along the door, and I tripped-hammered my finger along the tip of it off. And I said to there was inspector near me, I said, I think I done something to my finger. And I pulled my glove off, which had cotton gloves, and the top of it was all flattened out. Anyway, I think I had 30 shillings for and I was idle 10 days, and I went back to work.
Morris workers didn't yet have a moving line. Instead, they still moved the cars on themselves. Unlike Americans, who were paid a flat rate per hour, the British had no guaranteed income. They earned on a piecework basis. If they fell behind, they lost pay. If they got ahead, it meant a bonus.
The harder you work, the more money you get. And I was fit and strong and willing, and I wanted to get there where the harder I worked, the more I'd have. I was only there, I only wanted, like other people, I was only there for one purpose, to get the money.
Car industry pay packets were envied by other workers. As in America, the car towns were islands of prosperity as the Depression was starting.
There was houses being built all around Oxford, different estates, Sunnyside Estate, Florence Park Estates, different estates. And your one incentive was to get enough money to put a down payment on a house.
At a time when the old heavy industries were laying workers off, more assembly line factories opened in the southeast of England. As As companies saw the benefits of mass production, more men and women worked in the new way. The system was applied to batteries, vacuum cleaners, and biscuits.
There's a precision about this process that is utterly fascinating. And as one sees the ordinary rows of biscuits to be moving steadily towards the ovens, one cannot help marveling at the ingenuity of it all. Approximately a mile of biscuits, 20 deep, passes through one oven in a day.
At Reading, Huntley and Palmer's built their own equivalent of the River Rouge. Flour, butter and sugar poured in at one end. From the other streamed assorted biscuits. 3,000 worked there. Employers tried to keep unions out. Workers had to accept insecurity and sudden stoppages.
The foreman himself would come round and tell us that no more work on Saturday, you would be closed, shut out. And sometimes it would be a Saturday morning and a Monday all day, which we didn't care for because money-wise that made us very short.
The buying power of British wages was only a fifth as high as in America. The best paid still went to work on foot or by bicycle. Only the middle class could afford to buy the cars that were being produced.
Today, a woman uses the family car to take the children to school or to drive round to the shops. The car helps her to get through her daily routine quicker, leaving more time for exercise and enjoyment. It puts the country swimming pool within her reach, or takes her out to a golf course or tennis club in the afternoon. And now let's look at some of the additional accessories you can obtain for your Ford car. A combined sun visor and vanity mirror, so handy either for powdering your nose or keeping it from getting sunburnt. No need to disturb your handbag or exasperate your husband by using the car mirror. I have been keeping my most precious car possession to the last. Here it is. A radio set with which to while away long waits in traffic jams or to relieve the monotony of a long drive.
Though British employers didn't share the American boss's belief that paying high wages led to general growth, the consumer society was starting to cross the Atlantic.
This is the home of the radio gramophone. Hundreds of cabinets slowly moving on to completion. All components of the radio set are distributed by conveyors. We will just take a peep into the recording studio where Jack Hilton and his band are rehearsing.
How's that for balance, George? It's not so bad. I think we ought to have the violins up a little bit weak, you know. A bit nearer. A little more violins.
Now, 2 lines of girls. I should supply them with all the bits they needed. The shatters, the transformers, and the valves, and the wire. When the girls finished the wireless sets, I used to check them over, inspect them. I used to plug them in and leave them plugged in for 24 hours. That was called the soak test. Now, sometimes they blew up, or the fuse went, or they caught fire, and some of them came through okay, and then I stamped them up, and they went into the packing department. They were put into a cabinet, and then packed and sent out. They could never understand why it was called a wireless, because when you looked in the back of it, there was millions of wires all over. I said, how can you call that a wireless? And there's all these wires in there. And you say, well, it's the fact there's no wire between the chap you hear talking and this set, you know. It's completely, it comes over the air.
I get blue when I hear the wheeze of the choo-choo. Wow. I want you to go too with me on the choo-choo. Wow. The day's here, so get near, see what I have to say. Wow. Get your stuff and pack up, 'cause we're going away. Wow. The sun shines, my heart finds for those lasses and Kay.
Most streets now had electricity, and the products of the assembly line began to fill British homes.
of your troubles and blues.
Though new appliances didn't reach the depressed areas, car companies like to claim the engine of mass production was now pulling the whole economy forward.
And because we make a motor for a Surrey man to drive, there are cotton hands in Rochdale who will keep their hopes alive. And because we make a tractor for a farmer down in Kent, there are jobs up there in Durham, and there's money to be spent. There are women buying dresses, there are children being fed, there are mothers who can manage, there are lovers who can wed, there are hopes to be replenished, there are dreams to be restored, there are lives to reach fulfillment through the making of your Ford.
But while its supporters claimed so much for it, the Ford system had also become a powerful symbol for much that seemed wrong with 20th century life. In his novel, Brave New World, published in 1932, Aldous Huxley portrayed a brutal, standardized, emotionless society dominated by mass production, in which Henry Ford was God. The same year, French cinemas were showing Give Us Our Freedom, set in a gramophone factory. It satirized the effect of the line. Tyrannical managers watched over timid workers in prison uniforms. In the American film, Modern Times, originally called The Masses, Charlie Chaplin got enmeshed in the machinery of the giant factory where he worked. As efficiency experts increased the speed, he went berserk, seized by the jerking motions of his job. The whole system of mass production came under increasing attack from the left. When the Marxist artist Diego Rivera painted a mural of the River Rouge plant for a new Detroit art gallery, he showed sullen, angry workers in the clamor and din of huge machines. Paul Bautin was one of the faces in the picture.
He managed to capture some of my physical characteristics. My family says my nose has never been that long, but I don't know. Maybe it is. The machines are perfect designs, perfect designs. And in the faces of the workers, he wanted his models to recognize themselves, to see some part of themselves. The strength that was shown on the faces of the workers seemed intimidating to some people, because if they came off the wall with their strong muscles and their muscular brows, they may prove dangerous.
Some Detroit industrialists saw the mural as left-wing propaganda and wanted it whitewashed over. And in every country that now made cars on the assembly line, workers began to give voice to their anger.
You had become an animal, worse than a plain chunk of meat. You felt a complete frustration and isolation.
On a tant de pièces à faire dans une heure.
We had a certain number of parts to assemble each hour. You had to do it. No sooner did you finish one part than another one arrived. No stopping allowed.
Il ne faut pas s'arrêter. Donc,
the worker is just like a machine. With the machine, you push a button and it works non-stop. The worker just had to keep up.
Il faut qu'il suive la machine.
The whole place was laid out to get the greatest number of cars out in the shortest possible time, irrespective of what that meant as far as the worker was concerned. The worker was really part of the machinery, was in fact a robot.
Eddie Froh worked at Ford in Britain. In the 1930s, the level of frustration grew. British car workers also had no unions and could be laid off if sales fell or new plant was being installed. Agitation often came from those who'd known unions in other industries, like the young man who'd come by motorbike from the South Wales coalfield, Hayden Evans.
All these unskilled jobs in the press steel were all treated equal. And they had the same conditions, the same troubles, the same grievances. So you are a united people with no representation, nobody to answer for them. Right. We'll have a union.
After a strike, pressed steel finally recognized the union and agreed higher wages. It was a breakthrough for British car workers. At the Renault factory, the spark that ignited their revolt came when the management decided to speed up production.
One time we were assembling 100 parts an hour. Then the management decided to up the pace, and we had to do 110, then 120. Inevitably, things snapped. We'd had enough. We weren't machines.
At a time of political turmoil in France, the workers evicted the managers, occupied the plant, and declared a takeover. Food was sent to them as they camped in the offices. All over France, other workers did the same as those at Renault.
The men occupied the factories and the women went there every day. Not at night, though. We were pretty organized. We played cards, we danced, we managed to have some fun. It wasn't all bad.
The Renault workers had discovered their collective power. It seemed a glorious interlude of defiance against the line. After several weeks, the management capitulated. French workers won higher wages, a 40-hour week, and an annual holiday for the first time.
It's hard to believe, but out of 120 of us, there was only one who'd ever been on holiday. We packed our bags and went off to look at the sea. I was from Brittany and lived 30 kilometers from the sea, but I'd never seen it. It was quite a sight, seeing grown people playing like children.
Though many of their gains proved temporary, French workers had shown how it was possible to stop the assembly lines. Under the fascist regimes of Germany and Italy, any challenge was impossible. In Italy, Fiat was able to cut wages and increase hours in the 1930s because unions were illegal. For Felice Gentile, life was increasingly regimented.
On the job we'd work, how we'd work. You couldn't go for a smoke. Even when a man went to the toilet, they'd check to see if he was genuine or just wanted to slip off work for a chat. And if he did stop to chat and a guard came by or the manager and caught him there in the toilet, he'd be fired. There was nothing you could do about it.
Workers were called out to welcome their leader to Turin. Motor engineering and design represented national prestige and dynamism, and Mussolini took a close interest in what the assembly lines could do for fascism. Italians were offered a national system of workers' clubs and recreational facilities instead of unions and conflict. The communal benefits were meant to substitute for the larger individual pay packets workers had heard about from immigrants to America. Even in the communist Soviet Union, now attempting a rapid industrialization, engineers studied the arch-capitalist Henry Ford's methods to help get the output Stalin's planners demanded. Tractors and trucks were needed to build socialism, not cars. But the new factories that rolled them out in ever-increasing numbers were planned on Detroit lines with advice from Ford engineers. In America itself, the new consumer society had begun to turn sour after the Great Depression put nearly 14 million out of work. At first, the car companies managed to keep going, and unemployed men from all over the country converged on Detroit, hoping they could still find work there. Thousands waited outside the River Rouge plant. Paul Botin, already laid off once, waited along with the rest to get his old job back.
People stayed and stayed and stayed in desperation, and when you looked into their eyes, and you thought maybe that's what you look like, as you saw in the eyes of the others despair, you thought maybe you look like that to them.
Even those who counted themselves lucky still to be in work saw their conditions worsen. The line was run faster. Workers were put on short time, and rates of pay were cut.
The superintendent called us to the desk, one at a time, and told us we were working for 50 cents an hour, no matter what you were making. If you were making $1 an hour, you went down to 50 cents an hour.
Things were getting so bad, all the pressures of the line without the high pay to compensate, that workers began listening to recruiters from the emerging car workers union.
I met a guy by the name of Bill Mackay. And he says, we're going to get a union in this place. You know, what the hell is a union, you know? He said, well, these foremen won't have to be standing over there. But anyway, Bill gave me some literature, and he said, don't let anybody see this. Put it in your pocket and read it when you get home, you know. And I put it in my shirt pocket. Later on, I went home that next morning, went to reading about it and everything. So that's how I got involved in the union.
But with so much unemployment, the union organizers found recruiting hard. Then in 1932, the River Rouge factory virtually stopped production. The closures provoked a clash between workers and the company that was to provide a legend for the labor movement.
Out of many meetings and many discussions, it was decided that they would have a hunger march on Ford to let Ford know that he had promised us $5 a day, and he'd closed the plant without any explanation whatsoever. Now, we had got permission to march through Detroit.
When we got to this corner here, Miller and Dix, the fireworks started. Hoses started to pour ice water on top of us, and there was a cordon of police right across Miller Road proper, acting as a barricade. Right in this spot in here, there was piles of coal. And some of the people got on top of the piles of coal, and they threw the coals back at the police and at the company people on the other side of the fence. The march went on towards Gate 3, and that's where men were shot. Instead of getting jobs, we got lead, we got bullets, and blood.
Four demonstrators were shot dead by police outside the Ford plant. The Miller Road martyrs, as they were seen, helped draw public attention to the car workers' case. Washington now backed them too. There was a new Democrat government, and President Roosevelt's New Deal gave workers the legal right to have unions and collective bargaining. In 1937, the Auto Workers Union felt strong enough to take on other car companies. After a brief strike, the union was finally recognized by both General Motors and Chrysler. Only Henry Ford, the original inventor of the assembly line, still held out against the unions. When a new Ford car was launched in 1937, the promotion and salesmanship were as slick and modern as could be. Dealers were summoned to have their enthusiasm whipped up.
Gentlemen, how do you like the 1937 Ford V8?
But while the company boasted how advanced the car was, they still dealt with their workers in the same old authoritarian way. In the 27 years after the moving assembly line was first introduced, workers in other companies gradually regained some of the control they'd lost. But it wasn't until 1941 that the final showdown came at Ford. The unions had built their membership to the point where action was possible at last. After a fight broke out between a foreman and a worker, Jim Sullivan felt the moment had arrived.
So I went back and made my call. I told Mike Whitman, I said, Mike, it's now or never. They're ready. I can take them out. One of my first acts was to go up and push a red button to stop the line. I had a foreman named Jim Barberie. He rushed over to, what the hell do you think you're doing? So strike, strike. Everybody went to hollering, strike, strike, strike.
The world's biggest car plant ground to a halt.
I felt real good. I said, boy, I really done a job, you know? I was dancing the jig. I made history. I shut down the Ford Motor Company.
After the strike, the union had a legal contract with the company. From then on, all workers had to belong to the union. Changes to the speed of the line and work practices were to be jointly negotiated. The Ford contract, so hard won, became a model for the rest of American industry.
Toward Washington, D.C. in 1941, millions of U.S. citizens are looking anxiously for leadership in the greatest armament program of their nation's history. For not only must
the Second World War put new demands on the assembly lines. The days when managers dictated the terms were now over, and with labor so scarce, the balance of power in the factories shifted. America and its allies needed even greater output, and to secure it, they had to speed up the lines even faster and win the workers' cooperation.
Britain's huge mass production industry is totally at war. To mend the factories, every available man and woman who is not under arms is at work. Never before in Britain's history has production been so high. They're all in it together.
It was American methods that were still held up as the example to follow. British trade unionists were taken across the Atlantic to see what Fordism could do when it was aircraft that were being mass-produced. In 1 year alone, 96,000 planes were turned out in America, many by the car companies.
There's a whole line of these machines. That's the American idea, mass production. And it's just what is needed in wartime, too. It was a wonderful sight. And here was a finished wing coming to meet its fuselage. Here was production as I'd heard about it.
And it was also a chance to see the American workers' standard of living that they'd heard about.
It was my last night with the family. Ellen was getting dinner ready. A right smart little kitchen she had to work in. Everything easy to hand. And the living room. What a comfortable place. In this land of automobiles, people think nothing of living 20 miles away from where they work.
At the end of the war, American workers were still the best paid in the world. As the first to work on the assembly line, they'd also been the first to come to terms with it. In other countries, people would still have to live through many of the same battles for control before they could agree how to share the profits and reap the full benefits of a consumer society.